At the heart of the word Christmas is the word Christ. What does this term mean? Many years ago, I heard a radio program that was discussing Christianity's impact on the world. And the host explained that while he wasn't a Christian himself, he wanted to speak about Christianity and Jesus in particular in a respectful manner. It was hard to take him seriously, though, because throughout his discussion, he kept referring to Jesus as Mr. Christ. Now, it was pretty clear that he didn't know what he was talking about. In fact, I couldn't help but laugh every time he made this faux pas. Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's not as if Joseph and Mary were known as Mr. and Mrs. Christ. But if we want to enter into the Christmas mystery more fully, we need to better understand what the word Christ actually means. Here we need to examine the Jewish origins of the New Testament story. Of course, by Jesus' day, the Jewish people were living under oppression. In fact, many of the 12 tribes of Israel had historically been understood to be exiled, taken off as captives by the enemies of Israel. And while the Jews, those who lived in the southern part of Israel, had been exiled in the past, they did return to the land, only eventually to be defeated by their enemies and eventually by the Romans, who by Jesus' day had invaded the Holy Land and controlled the territory. In the scriptures, Moses had warned that if Israel was not obedient to God's law, they would be defeated and exiled and conquered by their enemies. Sin, Moses explains, will lead to suffering. Many in Jesus' day, therefore, understood that what had happened to them was ultimately the result of sin. But the scriptures of Israel also contained hope. Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, which means anointed one. In Hebrew, anointed one is Mashiach. It's where we get the English word Messiah. So to put it briefly, Christ means Messiah. Who would the Messiah be? Well, Jewish hopes for the future were not monolithic and they took different forms. Nevertheless, the dominant strand of expectation in Jesus' day was that the Messiah would be from the line of David, that he would be a royal figure like that great king of Israel's past. David, you probably know the story of David and Goliath, right? He grows up to be Israel's great king. Well, David was told that God would raise up his future offspring. Through the prophet Nathan, the Lord declares the following to David. He says, "When your days are completed and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you. I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I shall establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And he shall be my son." That's from 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and 13. In some ways now this promise is fulfilled in David's son, Solomon, who rules over Israel, who builds a temple, and is even described as God's son. Yet Solomon's kingdom did not actually last forever. And so it came to be understood that this prophecy would ultimately be realized in a future figure, in the Messiah. The traditional hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, gives voice to the way Christians believe God has fulfilled these expectations. Emmanuel means God with us. It comes from the prophet Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, we read about how God promises to preserve David's kingdom during a time when it was being threatened. God promises to raise up a child who is called Emmanuel. Within the book of Isaiah, scholars seem to agree that this refers to someone in Isaiah's day, most likely King Hezekiah, a righteous king. But Hezekiah is far from perfect, and the kingdom ultimately falls to its enemies. And so, like the prophecy made to David in 2 Samuel by Nathan, this oracle of Emmanuel is able to be understood as having a future fulfillment. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we learn that it's ultimately realized in the coming of Jesus Christ. He is God with us. So the song, O Come, Emmanuel, goes on, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Israel had been exiled because of its sin, and by Jesus' day, sin was understood to be a kind of a debt. Financial imagery was used for sin. It was a debt. And so to be freed from sin, Israel needed to, in a way, pay the price, or the price of deliverance had to be paid. They had to be, in a sense, ransomed. So we can recap. Israel had been exiled. They longed for a homecoming, and they knew that they were suffering due to sin, and they needed someone to set them free. And so at Christmas time, we see how all of these hopes come together, and Israel's hope is really our hope. Like Israel, we long for homecoming. We long for reconciliation. And the New Testament shows us that these hopes are realized in Christ. He's the one that saves us from sin. As he says in the Gospel of Matthew, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. There's that term, ransom, for many. In Christ, we find that our exile is over because Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, has appeared. He is God with us in a true sense. Much more could be said about this, about how Christ is the Messiah. We'll talk more about this in future videos. Please share this video with others. Thanks for watching. Until next time, Merry Christmas.